When the first Boeing B-29 Superfortress appeared over Tokyo on November 1, 1944, circling at an altitude of 32,000 feet, Japanese military observers on the ground stood helpless, watching through binoculars as the solitary four-engine aircraft conducted a reconnaissance mission completely beyond the reach of their fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft batteries. This single reconnaissance flight represented more than just an American bomber performing a mission. It symbolized a technological revolution that would fundamentally alter the Pacific War and expose a gap in Japanese military capabilities that no amount of courage or determination could overcome. The reaction among Japanese military leadership to this first appearance was a mixture of disbelief and growing alarm. Fighter squadrons scrambled from airfields around Tokyo, their pilots pushing their aircraft to maximum performance, climbing desperately through thin air in an attempt to intercept this intruder. But as they clawed their way upward, engines straining and controls becoming sluggish in the oxygen-depleted atmosphere, the American bomber remained serenely above them, a silver speck against the sky that might as well have been on another planet. The pilots who came closest to the B-29's altitude that day reported back to their commanders with accounts that bordered on the impossible. The American bomber was not struggling at this altitude. It was cruising comfortably, maintaining formation discipline, and showing no signs of the performance degradation that afflicted every Japanese aircraft above 25,000 feet. In the weeks that followed, as more B-29s appeared over Japanese cities, the reports flowing into Imperial General Headquarters painted an increasingly desperate picture. Squadron commanders reported that their best fighters, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate and the Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, could theoretically reach the altitudes where the B-29s operated, but theory and reality proved to be vastly different things. The operational ceiling listed in technical specifications assumed perfect conditions, minimal fuel loads, and high-octane aviation gasoline, that Japan's deteriorating industrial base could no longer provide consistently. By late 1944, Japanese forces were increasingly forced to use 87-octane fuel, a grade that significantly reduced engine performance, especially at high altitudes where every bit of power mattered. Before we continue with this incredible story of technological disparity and desperate courage, I want to ask you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more detailed historical content like this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about what you think you would have done facing such an impossible tactical situation. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the culmination of America's industrial and technological might, a bomber that had been designed from the beginning to operate in an environment where conventional aircraft could barely function. Its four Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines each produced 2,200 horsepower, but raw power was only part of the equation. Each engine was equipped with a two-speed, single-stage turbo supercharger, a complex piece of engineering that compressed the thin air at high altitudes and forced it into the cylinders, maintaining engine performance where naturally aspirated engines would gasp for oxygen. These turbo superchargers were temperamental devices that required careful management and added significant complexity to the aircraft. But they gave the B-29 capabilities that no Japanese aircraft could match. The bomber's pressurized crew compartments represented another revolutionary feature that Japanese aviation engineers could only dream of replicating with their limited resources. The B-29's pressure system maintained a cabin altitude of 8,000 feet, even when the aircraft flew at 30,000 feet, allowing the crew to work in relative comfort without the constant burden of oxygen masks and the debilitating effects of hypoxia that plagued high-altitude flight. This seemingly simple advantage had profound implications for combat effectiveness. American crews could fly long missions at high altitude and arrive over their targets alert and capable of precise work, while Japanese interceptor pilots who managed to reach similar altitudes arrived exhausted, hypoxic, with engines overheating and only minutes of fuel remaining for combat. The B-29's maximum speed at altitude further compounded Japanese difficulties. The Super Fortress could cruise at 220 miles per hour at high altitudes and could push its speed beyond 350 miles per hour when necessary. When flying with the jet stream, a high-altitude wind phenomenon that American navigators learned to exploit and that Japanese defenders found to be yet another insurmountable obstacle, B-29s could achieve ground speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. For Japanese fighter pilots attempting interceptions, this created a geometric nightmare. They had to climb to an invisible point in space, arrive at precisely the right moment to intercept a formation whose position they could barely track, and do so with enough fuel and performance remaining to actually engage the enemy. If they misjudged the intercept point by even a few miles or a few minutes, they would find themselves watching the B-29s disappear beyond reach, their fuel gauges showing empty tanks and their engines beginning to sputter. Japanese military leadership understood the technical specifications of their predicament with painful clarity. The Mitsubishi A6M0, the fighter that had dominated the early years of the Pacific War with its maneuverability and range, had a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour at its optimal altitude of 14,930 feet and a service ceiling of approximately 33,000 feet. But these numbers existed on paper only. In practical combat conditions, with combat loads and increasingly poor quality fuel, the Zero became combat ineffective above 25,000 feet. Its controls grew mushy, its engine lost power, and its legendary maneuverability disappeared in the thin air. The aircraft that had struck fear into Allied pilots in 1942 had become obsolete in the vertical dimension of warfare that the B-29 had opened. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, introduced in 1944 and considered one of Japan's finest fighters, represented a significant improvement over earlier designs. With a maximum speed of 427 miles per hour at 23,000 feet and a service ceiling of 38,800 feet, the Ki-84 looked on paper like it should have been capable of intercepting B-29s. Japanese commanders initially held high hopes that this fighter would provide an answer to the B-29 threat. But reality once again proved crueler than specifications suggested. The Ki-84's high service ceiling assumed a stripped-down aircraft with minimal fuel and ammunition, conditions that made it useless as a combat interceptor. When loaded for actual combat, with full ammunition and enough fuel to climb to altitude, fly a combat patrol, engage the enemy, and return to base, the Ki-84's effective ceiling dropped dramatically. More critically, it encountered the same problem that afflicted all Japanese high-altitude interceptors by late 1944. The industrial infrastructure that produced high-octane aviation fuel was being systematically destroyed by the very B-29s the fighters were supposed to intercept, creating a vicious cycle that Japanese military planners could see but could not break. Wing Commander Takeo Tanamizu of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, one of the most experienced fighter leaders defending the home islands, reported to his superiors after a series of attempted interceptions in December 1944 that his pilots were being asked to perform a task that bordered on the physically impossible. His squadron had scrambled dozens of times to intercept high-altitude B-29 formations, and the results were consistent and demoralizing. Pilots would push their aircraft to absolute maximum performance, climbing at rates that overheated their engines and left them gasping, even with oxygen masks. Those who managed to reach the B-29's altitude would arrive with engines on the verge of failure, barely enough fuel for a single attack pass, and controls so sluggish that precise gunnery became nearly impossible. The B-29s, meanwhile, maintained perfect formation discipline, their gunners alert and ready, their pilots able to make subtle course corrections that forced the exhausted Japanese pilots to waste precious fuel maneuvering for attack positions they could never quite achieve. The frustration in Tanemizu's reports reflected a broader crisis in Japanese air defense strategy. The entire defensive architecture had been designed for a different kind of war. Radar stations concentrated around major cities and military installations could detect incoming B-29 formations at distances of up to 300 kilometers, giving ample warning of approaching raids. But warning time meant nothing when interceptors could not reach the intruder's altitude. Ground controllers would vector fighters toward incoming raids, but the pilots found themselves in a three-dimensional chess game they could not win. They had to estimate where the B-29 formation would be 15 or 20 minutes in the future, begin climbing toward that point, and hope their calculations were correct, all while managing engines that were temperamental, even in ideal conditions, and increasingly unreliable as maintenance standards deteriorated and spare parts became scarce. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots cannot be overstated. These were men who had been told since their first day of training that spirit and determination could overcome material disadvantages, that the warrior's will was the deciding factor in combat. They had seen this principle validated in the early victories of the war, when Japanese forces had overcome numerically superior opponents through superior tactics and fighting spirit. But the B-29 represented a challenge that no amount of spirit could overcome. It was not a matter of courage or skill. The mathematics of altitude, speed, and fuel consumption were implacable. Pilots who had survived years of combat, who had faced death countless times and never flinched, found themselves defeated by physics before they could even bring their guns to bear on the enemy. By January 1945, desperation began to drive Japanese tactics in new directions. If conventional interception was impossible, then unconventional methods would be attempted. The tactic of ramming, deliberately crashing one's aircraft into an enemy bomber, had been used sporadically by Japanese pilots facing bomber formations they could not effectively attack with gunfire. Now, as the B-29 raids intensified and conventional interception continued to fail, ramming attacks became not just accepted, but officially encouraged. Special units were formed with pilots who volunteered for these missions, men who understood that ramming a B-29 at high altitude was essentially a mission with no return. The plan called for fighters to be stripped of unnecessary weight, loaded with just enough fuel to reach the B-29's altitude, and flown by pilots who would aim their entire aircraft at the enemy bomber, hoping to cause catastrophic damage before bailing out. The reality of these ramming attacks highlighted the desperation of Japan's situation more than any official statement could. Even with every possible advantage, with pilots who were willing to give their lives, with aircraft stripped down to maximize altitude performance, the success rate of these missions remained minimal. The closing speed between a Japanese fighter diving on a B-29 and the bomber itself was approximately 600 miles per hour. At that speed, as American defensive analyses noted, it required only a slight movement of the B-29's controls to evade the ramming attempt. Japanese pilots, arriving at intercept altitude with engines overheating and fuel tanks nearly empty, often had only one chance to position themselves for a ramming attack. If they missed, they had no fuel for a second attempt and faced the grim choice of bailing out over their own territory and hoping to survive or trying to glide their fighter to a crash landing. American bomber crews reported seeing Japanese fighters attempting these desperate attacks and described the encounters with a mixture of respect for the courage involved and awareness of how one-sided the engagement had become. B-29 gunners operating remote-controlled turrets from their pressurized positions within the bomber could engage Japanese fighters from multiple angles simultaneously. The B-29's defensive armament system represented yet another technological advantage. Rather than having gunners physically positioned at each gun, which would have required multiple unpressurized positions and reduced the crew's effectiveness at high altitude, the B-29 used a centralized fire control system. Gunners sat at computing gun sights that calculated lead, deflection, and range, controlling turrets remotely with remarkable accuracy. This meant that a single B-29 could bring multiple guns to bear on an attacking fighter from angles that would have been impossible with conventional gun positions. The jet stream added another dimension to the B-29's invulnerability that Japanese military planners had not anticipated and could not counter. American navigators flying from bases in the Mariana Islands discovered that at altitudes above 30,000 feet, powerful west-to-east winds, sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour, flowed over Japan. These winds were not constant or predictable, but once discovered and mapped, they provided American bombers with an additional speed advantage that turned already difficult interceptions into impossible ones. B-29s flying with the jet stream could achieve ground speeds that exceeded the maximum speed of most Japanese fighters in level flight. Interceptors scrambling to engage these formations would find themselves trying to catch bombers that were essentially moving faster than the fighters could fly, a situation that defied every principle of fighter tactics. The same jet stream that gave B-29s incredible speed also created problems for bombing accuracy, particularly during the early high-altitude raids. Bombs released from 30,000 feet into winds exceeding 100 miles per hour would be scattered widely, making precision bombing of specific industrial targets nearly impossible. American strategic planners watching the results of these early high-altitude raids faced a dilemma. The altitude advantage made the B-29s nearly invulnerable, but it also made them ineffective at the precision bombing missions they had been designed to perform. This dilemma would eventually lead to one of the war's most significant tactical shifts, but before that shift occurred, Japanese military leadership had to confront the reality that their air defense system was essentially helpless against high-altitude B-29 raids. Documents captured after the war revealed the internal discussions within Imperial General Headquarters about the B-29 threat. Some officers argued for concentrating all available resources on developing high-altitude interceptors that could match the B-29's performance. Prototypes were developed, including the turbocharged Ki-87 and rocket-powered J-8M, aircraft designed specifically to operate at extreme altitudes where standard fighters could not function. But development time, technical difficulties, and Japan's collapsing industrial infrastructure ensured that these specialized interceptors never reached operational service in meaningful numbers. By the time prototypes were being tested, the war situation had deteriorated to the point where the resources needed to produce these aircraft in quantity simply did not exist. Other officers advocated for accepting that high-altitude interception was impossible and instead focusing on developing tactics for low-altitude defense, hoping that American bombers would be forced to descend to lower altitudes where Japanese fighters could engage them effectively. This line of thinking proved partially prescient, but not in a way that provided any comfort to Japanese defenders. When American tactics did shift to low-altitude operations, it came with such overwhelming force and such devastating effectiveness that the results were even more catastrophic than the high-altitude raids had been. Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command in the Mariana Islands in January 1945, and his assessment of the B-29 campaign's effectiveness was brutally honest. High-altitude raids were not producing results commensurate with the resources being expended. The jet stream scattered bombs, cloud cover over Japan obscured targets more often than not, and while losses were acceptably low, the strategic impact was minimal. LeMay made a decision that shocked his crews and electrified his commanders. The B-29s would shift from high-altitude daylight precision bombing to low-altitude nighttime incendiary attacks. The bombers would fly at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, low enough to avoid the jet stream and ensure accurate bomb placement. And they would attack at night, when Japanese fighters would have even more difficulty with interceptions. The tactical shift represented a calculated gamble. At lower altitudes, B-29s would be within range of anti-aircraft fire, and Japanese fighters would be able to reach them easily. But LeMay's analysis suggested that Japanese night fighter capability was minimal, that their radar-directed anti-aircraft fire was ineffective, and that the advantage of accurate bombing would outweigh the increased vulnerability. To further reduce weight and increase bomb load, he ordered the removal of most defensive armament except tail guns, a decision that left many crews feeling exposed and vulnerable, but which allowed each B-29 to carry a significantly larger payload of incendiary bombs. The first test of this new tactic came on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, in a raid that would be known as Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo. 334 B-29s took off from bases in the Marianas, formed up over the Pacific, and approached Tokyo in streams rather than tight formations. They came in low, between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, and they carried bombs specifically designed for one purpose: to create an unstoppable firestorm in Tokyo's densely packed residential and industrial districts. The M69 incendiary bomblet, clustered in groups of 38 inside E-46 cluster bombs, was designed to penetrate roofs before igniting, starting fires deep inside buildings where they would be difficult to extinguish. Japanese defenders, who had struggled helplessly against high-altitude B-29 raids, now faced a different kind of nightmare. The bombers were finally within range, and fighter squadrons scrambled frantically to intercept them. But the raid came at night, and Japanese night fighter capability was virtually non-existent. Radar coverage, designed to detect incoming raids, and vector fighters to intercept points, functioned adequately for detection, but proved almost useless for the kind of precise vectoring needed for night interception. Fighter pilots found themselves flying through darkness, searching desperately for bombers they could hear but could not see, occasionally catching glimpses of exhaust flames or being silhouetted by searchlights and fires below, but rarely getting into position for effective attacks. Anti-aircraft fire, the other pillar of Japanese air defense, proved equally ineffective. Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine relied heavily on visual tracking and prediction, methods that worked poorly against fast-moving targets at night. Searchlights that might have illuminated bombers for anti-aircraft gunners instead served primarily to help B-29 crews identify their targets by the fires already burning below. The few Japanese fighters that did manage to locate B-29s in the darkness found that attacking a bomber at night, even a bomber stripped of most of its defensive armament, remained extraordinarily difficult. Depth perception in darkness was nearly impossible, closing speeds were difficult to judge, and the B-29's remaining tailguns proved quite capable of defending against the small number of fighters that pressed attacks home. The results of Operation Meeting House were catastrophic beyond anything either side had anticipated. The incendiary bombs, dropped in unprecedented concentration over a relatively small area of northeastern Tokyo, started hundreds of individual fires that rapidly merged into a firestorm. Driven by strong winds and feeding on the wooden construction that dominated Tokyo's residential districts, the fires created their own weather, generating winds that reached hurricane force and temperatures that exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. Over 90,000 people perished in that single night, possibly over 100,000, making it probably the most destructive air raid in human history up to that point. Approximately 16 square miles of Tokyo were burned to ashes, and over 1 million people were left homeless. For Japanese military leadership, Operation Meeting House represented a different kind of defeat than the high-altitude raids had inflicted. At high altitude, the B-29s had been untouchable but relatively ineffective. Now, flying low and at night, They remained nearly untouchable, but had demonstrated the capability to destroy entire sections of major cities in single raids. The response from Imperial General Headquarters reflected this grim new reality. Directives went out to increase night fighter training, to develop better radar-directed interception capabilities, to improve anti-aircraft defenses, and to implement more effective civil defense measures. But these directives could not change the fundamental reality that Japan's air defense system, designed for a different kind of war, could not adapt quickly enough to counter a threat that was evolving faster than countermeasures could be developed. The firebombing campaign that followed Operation Meeting House systematically targeted Japan's major cities. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other industrial and residential centers experienced raids similar to Tokyo's, though none quite matched the horrific casualties of that first firestorm. Japanese fighter squadrons continued to scramble against these raids, and pilots continued to display remarkable courage in pressing attacks against bombers that outnumbered them and outgunned them. But courage without effective weapons and tactics could not change outcomes. Losses among B-29 crews, while higher during low-altitude raids than they had been during high-altitude missions, remained within acceptable ranges, and the strategic impact of the firebombing campaign was devastating. By mid-1945, Japan's industrial production had collapsed, not primarily because factories had been destroyed, though many had been, but because the transportation networks, the utility infrastructure, and the worker housing that supported industrial production had been systematically burned away. Workers who had lost their homes could not report to factories. Factories without electricity or water could not operate. Transportation networks disrupted by bombing could not move raw materials or finished goods. The cumulative effect went beyond the physical destruction visible in reconnaissance photographs. It represented the dismantling of Japan's ability to wage war. The B-29 also contributed to Japan's defeat through a method that received less attention than the spectacular firebombing raids, but which proved equally devastating. Mining operations, codenamed Operation Starvation, used B-29s flying low-altitude night missions to drop thousands of naval mines in the approaches to Japanese ports and in the narrow channels of the inland sea. These mines, laid with precision that only radar-equipped bombers could achieve, effectively blockaded Japan. Merchant ships that attempted to move cargo between Japanese ports faced a gauntlet of mines that claimed vessels faster than they could be swept. After April 1945, the B-29 mining campaign accounted for more Japanese merchant marine losses than American submarines, a remarkable achievement given the submarine fleet's earlier dominance in the campaign against Japanese shipping. Japanese military leadership watched these developments with growing despair. Every defensive measure they attempted seemed to be countered by American adaptation. When Japanese fighters developed tactics for attacking B-29 formations, the Americans changed their formation patterns. When Japanese anti-aircraft defenses concentrated around one set of targets, the B-29s shifted to attacking different targets. When radar-directed searchlights became more effective at illuminating night raiders, the B-29s came in at altitudes below the searchlight's effective range. The campaign had become a one-sided contest in adaptation and innovation, with American forces demonstrating a flexibility that Japanese forces could not match. The atomic bomb missions represented the ultimate expression of the B-29's altitude advantage and the helplessness of Japanese air defenses. On August 6, 1945, a specially modified B-29 named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, approached Hiroshima at an altitude of 31,060 feet. The bomber had been stripped of all defensive armament except tail guns, reducing weight and allowing it to fly at even higher altitudes than standard B-29s. Japanese early warning radar detected the small formation, 3 aircraft including the bomber, and 2 escort planes for observation and measurement, but the size of the formation did not trigger a general alarm. Individual B-29s, or small formations, had been observed before on reconnaissance missions, and precious fuel could not be wasted, scrambling large fighter formations against every small contact. A few Japanese fighters did scramble from airfields near Hiroshima, but they arrived too late and could not reach the bomber's altitude before the weapon was released. The Little Boy atomic bomb fell for 53 seconds before detonating at an altitude of approximately 1,968 feet above the city. Enola Gay, traveling at maximum speed after bomb release, was 11.5 miles away when the shock wave reached it, far enough that although the bomber was buffeted significantly, it sustained no damage. 3 days later, a second atomic mission against Nagasaki proceeded similarly. The bomber Bockscar dropped the Fat Man weapon from 28,900 feet, and once again Japanese interceptors proved unable to reach the bomber's altitude in time to prevent the attack. The atomic missions, conducted from altitudes that Japanese fighters could barely reach and could not effectively engage even if they did, crystallized everything that Japanese military leadership had learned about the B-29 threat over the preceding 9 months. The bomber represented not just a tactical advantage, but a fundamental shift in the nature of strategic warfare. It could deliver weapons of unprecedented destructiveness from altitudes that rendered conventional air defenses obsolete, and Japan possessed no effective counter to this capability. The Emperor's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, did not mention the B-29 specifically, but the bomber's presence permeated every aspect of the strategic situation that made surrender inevitable. In the months after the war, American intelligence teams interviewed Japanese military officers, gathering first-hand accounts of how Japan's air defense establishment had viewed and responded to the B-29 campaign. These interviews revealed perspectives that official wartime communications had concealed. Officers spoke candidly about the frustration of watching formations of B-29s pass overhead, untouchable and inexorable. They described the desperation of ordering pilots on missions that everyone knew were nearly suicidal, not because of dramatic enemy action, but because of the simple physics of trying to intercept aircraft operating beyond one's reach. They acknowledged that by mid-1945, morale among fighter pilots had deteriorated significantly, not from lack of courage, but from the soul-crushing experience of repeated failure against an enemy they could see but could not fight effectively. The technical gap between the B-29 and Japanese fighters reflected broader technological and industrial disparities between the United States and Japan. While Japanese aviation engineers understood the principles of pressurized cabins, turbo-superchargers, and high-altitude flight, they lacked the industrial capacity, the material resources, and the time to develop and deploy systems that could match American capabilities. The few advanced interceptors that reached prototype stage demonstrated that Japanese engineers could design effective high-altitude fighters when given the opportunity. But opportunity was a luxury that Japan's deteriorating war situation could not provide. By the time these advanced designs were being tested, American forces controlled the skies over Japan so completely that the question was no longer whether Japan could develop effective countermeasures, but how much longer Japan could continue fighting at all. The B-29 campaign against Japan demonstrated principles that would shape strategic thinking in the post-war era. Control of the vertical dimension of warfare, the ability to operate at altitudes beyond enemy reach, provided advantages that multiplied the effectiveness of every other aspect of military power. The psychological impact of facing an enemy that operated with apparent impunity had strategic consequences beyond the physical destruction inflicted. The integration of multiple capabilities, high-altitude performance, pressurization, heavy armament, long range, and precision navigation created a weapon system that was greater than the sum of its parts. Japanese military leadership's reaction to the B-29 evolved over the course of the campaign from initial shock and disbelief, through desperate attempts at tactical adaptation, to ultimate acceptance that they faced a threat they could not effectively counter with available resources. This progression reflected not any lack of courage or tactical skill on the part of Japanese forces, but rather the harsh reality that material and technological advantages, when sufficiently large, could not be overcome through spirit alone. The B-29 forced Japanese military thought to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of modern warfare, truths that challenged fundamental assumptions about how wars were won. The altitude capabilities of the B-29 Superfortress, combined with its speed, range, and payload capacity, created a strategic weapon that changed the calculus of the Pacific War. Japanese generals and air defense commanders, watching formations of silver bombers crossing Japanese skies at altitudes their best interceptors could barely reach, understood that they were witnessing a revolution in warfare. Their reactions, documented in reports, interviews, and after-action analyses, revealed not just tactical concerns, but a deeper understanding that the traditional methods of air defense had been rendered obsolete by technological advancement. The B-29 represented a preview of post-war strategic aviation where altitude, speed, and technological sophistication would define capability more than numerical strength or pilot skill. For Japan in 1945, this preview came too late to counter, but soon enough to demonstrate beyond any doubt that the war they had started 4 years earlier had been lost not just on battlefields and seas, but in the realm of industrial and technological capability that the B-29 so dramatically exemplified. Before I conclude, I hope you've found this detailed examination of the B-29's impact on Japanese air defense both informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed this deep dive into military history, please consider subscribing and checking out our other videos about World War II aviation and strategic bombing campaigns. Your comments and questions always enhance these discussions, so please share your thoughts below. The legacy of the B-29 and Japan's inability to counter it effectively extended far beyond the immediate context of World War II. It influenced post-war aviation development, shaped strategic bombing doctrine, and demonstrated principles of technological advantage that remained relevant throughout the Cold War and beyond. For the Japanese pilots and commanders who faced the Superfortress in the skies over their homeland, it represented an opponent that embodied everything their training and experience had not prepared them to face. An enemy that won not through superior fighting spirit or tactical brilliance, but through technological and industrial capabilities that created advantages no amount of courage could overcome.